The studio went completely silent. Elon Musk, live on air, just called out Keir Starmer in a way that nobody saw coming, and the shockwave is still reverberating through British politics. This wasn't a casual comment or a throwaway opinion. This was a calculated, devastating takedown of the Prime Minister by one of the most influential people on the planet, delivered with receipts, with specifics, and with a level of detail that made it impossible for anyone to dismiss as uninformed commentary. The host didn't know how to respond. The other guests sat frozen. And millions watching live just witnessed something that the British political establishment has been desperately trying to prevent. Someone with a massive global platform speaking unfiltered truth about what's really happening in the UK government. Musk didn't hold back, didn't use diplomatic language, didn't soften his criticism to avoid controversy. He laid out exactly what he thinks about Starmer's leadership, about the policies being implemented, about the gap between what the government says and what it actually does. And he did it with the kind of directness that politicians hate, because it cuts through all the carefully crafted messaging and exposes the reality underneath. This is the moment that Starmer's team has been dreading since they took power. The moment when someone who can't be intimidated, can't be controlled, and can't be silenced decides to tell the world exactly what they see. Musk has nothing to lose from speaking his mind. He doesn't need British government contracts, doesn't need favourable media coverage from UK outlets, doesn't need to maintain relationships with the political establishment. He can say what everyone else is thinking, but too afraid to voice, and that makes him incredibly dangerous to people like Starmer, who rely on controlling the narrative to maintain their grip on power. What Musk revealed during that interview goes beyond just criticism of one Prime Minister. It exposed systemic problems with how Britain is being governed, how decisions are being made, and how the public is being misled about the true state of affairs. And the silence that followed his comments spoke volumes about how devastating and accurate his assessment really was. The interview was supposed to be a standard discussion about technology, innovation, and the future of various industries. Musk had been invited on to talk about his companies, about developments in space exploration and electric vehicles, about artificial intelligence and its implications for society. The host was clearly expecting a relatively safe conversation that would generate interesting content without causing too much controversy. But about 20 minutes into the discussion, the conversation took a turn that nobody had anticipated. The host, perhaps trying to add some topical relevance to the interview, asked Musk about his thoughts on government regulation of technology and whether he felt that different countries were taking the right approach to managing innovation. It was meant to be a softball question that would allow Musk to talk generally about regulatory frameworks and government policy. Instead, Musk used it as an opening to address something that had clearly been on his mind for a while. He paused for a moment, looked directly at the camera and said he wanted to talk specifically about what was happening in the United Kingdom under Keir Starmer's government. The shift in his tone was immediate and unmistakable. This wasn't going to be a polite diplomatic assessment. This was going to be something much more direct and much more damaging. The host's expression changed as they realised where this was heading. But there was no way to stop it without making things worse. They were live. The interview was streaming to millions of people, and Musk had already started speaking. Musk began by acknowledging that he doesn't usually comment on the internal politics of other countries, that he generally believes each nation should sort out its own affairs without outside interference. But he said that what's happening in Britain under Starmer represents something too important to ignore, because it's not just about British politics. It's about a pattern of governance that threatens innovation, economic growth, and individual freedom in ways that should concern everyone who cares about the future. He described Starmer's approach as fundamentally hostile to the kind of entrepreneurship and risk-taking that drives human progress. He talked about policies that punish success, regulations that strangle innovation before it can flourish, and a mindset among the current government that views business and wealth creation with suspicion rather than as engines of prosperity that benefit everyone. Musk didn't speak in vague generalities. He cited specific examples of British companies that were struggling or relocating because of regulatory burdens and hostile government attitudes. He mentioned conversations he'd had with British entrepreneurs who felt abandoned by their own government, who saw more support and encouragement from other countries than they received at home. He talked about the brain drain happening as talented people left the UK for places that actually valued their contributions and didn't treat success as something to be apologised for or heavily taxed into oblivion. The detail and specificity of his criticism made it impossible to dismiss as someone who didn't know what he was talking about. This was clearly based on real knowledge, real conversations and real observation of what was happening on the ground. Then Musk did something even more devastating. He drew explicit parallels between what he was seeing from Starmer's government and historical examples of governments that had stifled innovation and economic growth through similar approaches. He talked about how centralising power, increasing regulatory control and treating the private sector as an adversary rather than a partner had consistently led to stagnation and decline. He mentioned that some of the rhetoric coming from Starmer's government reminded him of failed economic policies from decades past, policies that had been thoroughly discredited by real-world results, but were apparently being recycled with new branding. The host attempted to interject, perhaps to defend the Prime Minister or to suggest that Musk was being unfair, but Musk cut them off politely but firmly. He said he wasn't finished and that people needed to hear this because the British public was being fed a narrative that bore no relationship to the reality of what was actually happening. He continued by addressing Starmer's personal leadership style, describing it as insecure and controlling in ways that were counterproductive for effective governance. Musk noted that truly confident leaders surround themselves with people who challenge them and disagree with them, because that's how you avoid mistakes and make better decisions. But from what he could observe, Starmer seemed to surround himself with yes men and pushed out anyone who questioned his approach or brought inconvenient facts to his attention. This creates an echo chamber where bad ideas never get properly challenged and where the leadership becomes increasingly disconnected from reality. Musk referenced the recent incidents that had made headlines, the confrontation with Tom Hardy and the PMQ's disaster where the Speaker had to publicly reprimand Starmer. He said these weren't isolated incidents, but rather symptoms of a leader who can't handle criticism or accountability, who views questions as attacks and dissent as betrayal. He pointed out that this kind of thin-skinned defensiveness is extremely dangerous in someone who holds executive power, because it means they're more focused on protecting their ego than on actually serving the public interest. The criticism was surgical and brutal, delivered with the kind of casual confidence that comes from someone who has nothing to fear from speaking his mind. Musk didn't seem angry or emotional. He was simply stating what he saw as obvious facts that needed to be said. And that calm, matter-of-fact delivery made the criticism even more devastating because it framed everything as reasonable observation rather than partisan attack. The studio had gone remarkably quiet. Usually during interviews, there's background noise, producers talking, crew moving around. But everyone had stopped what they were doing to listen to what was unfolding. The host looked genuinely uncomfortable, clearly aware that this interview had just become major news but uncertain how to manage it. They tried to move the conversation to different topics several times, but Musk kept circling back to his central point, that Britain under Starmer was heading in a dangerous direction that would harm ordinary citizens while benefiting only the political class and their allies in the bureaucracy and consulting firms. Musk then shifted his focus to the economic policies being implemented by Starmer's government, and this is where his criticism became even more specific and harder to refute. He pulled out his phone and started referencing actual data, actual numbers from government budgets and economic reports. He talked about the massive spending on consultants and external contractors while claiming there wasn't money for essential services. He cited the exact figures that had been raised during the PMQ session that led to Starmer's meltdown, noting that the Prime Minister had refused to answer straightforward questions about where taxpayer money was actually going. Musk pointed out that this kind of financial opacity is a massive red flag, because governments that won't clearly account for how they're spending public money are usually hiding something. He suggested that if people actually looked at where the money was flowing, they'd find a system designed to benefit insiders and cronies rather than to deliver value to citizens. He talked about procurement processes that seemed designed to favour certain firms regardless of whether they provided the best service or the best value. He mentioned that some of the consulting contracts being awarded didn't even have clear deliverables or success metrics. They were essentially blank cheques to companies with the right political connections. Now, so this kind of corruption, and Musk used that word deliberately, was something he'd seen in various countries around the world, and it always ended the same way, with public services degraded, public trust destroyed, and ordinary people paying the price for a system rigged against them. The host, perhaps feeling obligated to push back, suggested that Musk might not understand the full context of British governance and that some of his criticisms might be oversimplified. Musk's response was withering without being rude. He pointed out that he runs multiple companies across multiple countries, that he deals with government regulations and policies constantly, and that he probably has a better understanding of how governments actually function than most politicians do. He said that the complexity argument is what people always use when they don't want to answer simple questions honestly. Budgets aren't actually that complicated. You have money coming in, you have money going out, and you should be able to explain clearly what you're spending it on and what results you're getting. When someone can't or won't do that, it's not because the situation is too complex to explain, it's because they don't want people to know the truth. He then made a broader point about accountability in government, arguing that the British people deserve leaders who treat them like adults capable of understanding difficult issues. Instead, they're getting leaders who hide behind jargon and complexity to avoid explaining their actual decisions. This patronising approach, Musk argued, is part of why trust in government has collapsed and why people feel increasingly alienated from the political system that's supposed to represent them. He suggested that Starmer's defensiveness and secrecy weren't strengths or signs of serious leadership. They were weaknesses that revealed someone who knew his decisions wouldn't stand up to scrutiny. Musk also addressed the broader cultural and social policies being pursued by Starmer's government, though he was careful to distinguish between policies he simply disagreed with and policies he thought were actively harmful. He said reasonable people can disagree about the right level of regulation or the right balance between individual freedom and collective responsibility. But what concerned him was the tendency of Starmer's government to shut down debate, to treat disagreement as dangerous, and to use the machinery of state power to suppress voices that challenged the official narrative. He mentioned specific examples of people who had faced professional consequences for expressing views that differed from government orthodoxy on various issues. He talked about the chilling effect this creates, where people self-censor because they're afraid of being targeted if they speak honestly. This kind of environment, Musk argued, is toxic to innovation, to progress, and to the kind of open discourse that's essential for solving complex problems. When people are afraid to question prevailing assumptions or to propose unconventional solutions, you get stagnation and groupthink. You get bad policies that never get properly challenged because everyone who might criticise them has been silenced or pushed out. The host tried to suggest that Musk was exaggerating, that Britain remained a free country with robust protections for speech and expression. Musk didn't back down. He pointed out that freedom isn't just about what's technically legal, it's about the practical ability to speak without fear of retaliation. And when the government controls access to funding, contracts and opportunities, they have enormous power to punish dissent, even without passing laws against it. The conversation had been going on for nearly 40 minutes at this point, far longer than the segment was supposed to run, but nobody was stopping it because everyone realised they were witnessing something significant. Musk had essentially delivered a comprehensive indictment of Starmer's government on live television, and he'd done it with enough specific detail and evidence that it couldn't be dismissed as ignorant ranting from someone who didn't know what he was talking about. The silence in the studio wasn't just about shock, it was about the recognition that this would have massive political implications. Other guests who were waiting to appear later in the show were standing off camera watching, their own segments forgotten in the face of what was unfolding. Production staff were frantically messaging their superiors, trying to figure out how to handle what was happening. And on social media, the clip was already going viral, being shared millions of times by people who were thrilled to see someone with Musk's platform saying what they'd been thinking but hadn't been able to articulate or amplify effectively. The political establishment's worst nightmare was happening in real time. Someone they couldn't control was speaking truth to power with a global audience watching. Musk wrapped up this portion of his criticism by saying that he hoped British voters were paying attention to what was actually happening versus what they were being told was happening. He said that democracy only works when people have access to accurate information and when they hold their leaders accountable for results rather than for rhetoric. After Musk finished his extended criticism of Starmer's government, the studio remained in that uncomfortable silence for several seconds. The host eventually attempted to regain control of the interview by asking Musk what he thought Britain should do differently, perhaps hoping to move the conversation from criticism to something more constructive. But Musk wasn't interested in letting Starmer and his team off the hook that easily. He said that the first step was for the British public to stop accepting obvious lies and spin from their government. He urged people to look at actual outcomes rather than listening to promises and press releases. He suggested that voters should judge their leaders based on whether things are actually getting better for ordinary people, not based on whether politicians give good speeches or produce slick communications. He talked about the importance of demanding transparency, of insisting that public money be spent wisely and accounted for clearly, of refusing to accept complexity as an excuse for opacity. Musk argued that citizens have far more power than they realise if they're willing to use it, but that power only works if people stay informed and stay engaged rather than tuning out, because politics seems too frustrating or too corrupt to bother with. He acknowledged that staying engaged is exhausting when you feel like the system is rigged against you, but he insisted that giving up and checking out only makes things worse because it leaves the field clear for exactly the kind of self-serving politicians who caused the problems in the first place. The host asked whether Musk thought Starmer could change course, whether there was any possibility of the government learning from criticism and adjusting its approach. Musk's response was blunt and unsparing. He said that in his experience, leaders who are as defensive and controlling as Starmer rarely change because changing would require admitting they were wrong. And people with that kind of ego structure find admission of error almost psychologically impossible. He suggested that the pattern of behaviour they'd seen from Starmer, the inability to handle criticism, the attacking of questioners rather than answering questions, the attempts to intimidate and silence critics, these weren't things that get better with time or pressure. If anything, they tend to get worse as the leader becomes more isolated and more surrounded by people who only tell them what they want to hear. Musk said he'd seen this dynamic play out in corporate settings and in government settings across multiple countries, and it almost always ends badly. The leader either gets forced out eventually or they hang on but become increasingly ineffective as they lose credibility and support. Either way, the damage done during that period of decline can be enormous and can take years to repair. He expressed sympathy for the British people who were stuck with this leadership and urged them not to wait for Starmer to suddenly become the leader he'd promised to be, because that transformation wasn't coming.